Hi guys, thanks for tuning into NDR. I have a very slightly different kind of video for you all today. We're not going to be reviewing tech or traveling anywhere. Instead, we're going to talk about Russia. Now, what prompted me to film this video? Last night I was actually watching a live stream by PewDiePie, and sort of on a whim, I decided to leave a comment asking Felix to come to Russia, to come to Moscow and stream from the Red Square in order to defeat T-Series. Obviously, this was meant as a bit of a joke, but nonetheless, Felix actually responded.
You need to come to Russia, Felix. Stream with the red from the Red Square to defeat T-Series. Me and Mars actually wanted to go to Russia, but then we understood it's really you have to like apply for a visa, and it's kind of a process, and we just couldn't be bothered.
So that really got me thinking because from my own experience working with expats and meeting with all sorts of different foreigners from different countries, be they tourists or business partners, they all had the same sort of reservations about coming to Russia in the first place, about coming here to visit, to explore the country. They all asked the same basic questions before deciding to take the plunge and to book a vacation, for example, to Russia. So I started to do a little bit of digging. I went on to Reddit, I went on to Google, and typed in all sorts of different queries with the word Russia, just to try to get an idea of what exactly people are searching for, what kind of questions people want to ask when they first become interested in Russia as a potential vacation destination or as a place they would like to try to work in. So what I decided to do is answer some of these questions from Reddit and Google, so you guys have a sort of basis to go off of if you've just become interested in traveling to Russia for whatever reason, or in getting acquainted with Russian culture, for example. Anyway, let's get right into answering these questions. So the first and most basic question that I saw on Google is Russia in Europe? And the answer is yes and no. It really depends on what you're asking. If the question is Russia a European Union state? No, it's not. There are 28 member states of the European Union, and Russia is not one of them. However, Russia is part of the European continent. Russia is actually a Eurasian country. The western part of Russia is in Europe, is in the European continent, and the eastern part of Russia, central Russia and eastern Russia, are part of Asia. So it is a very big country, and that shouldn't come as much of a surprise if you've looked at a map of the Earth recently. But at over 17 million square kilometers, it's actually the biggest country in the world. As a matter of fact, it takes up 1/8 of the entire livable surface of our world. So again, huge country. And occupying all that space are just 150 million Russians. When we say Russians, we tend to mean all the nationalities of Russia, because Russia is a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation. It has been for hundreds of years, and we have people representing, again, all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of religions, and for the most part, all of these people with their different yet very oftentimes intertwining traditions, religions, culture, and history. They've all been living in relative peace and harmony for hundreds of years, so you could very well say that Russia is definitely a cultural melting pot in that regard. Moving on. Is Russia a developed country? From a purely statistical and analytical point of view, Russia is definitely a developing nation. It's actually a founding member, one of the founding members of the BRICS organization of developing nations, which is composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which are some of the fastest developing and economically expanding states in the world. However, for simplicity's sake, from the point of view of a Russian local or a tourist that's visiting or an expat that's moved to Russia, which would all probably be visiting larger cities or their suburbs, then yes, Russia is definitely a developed nation. The bulk of Russia's population actually lives in so-called millionaire cities, which are cities with a population of at least 1 million people. There are 16 of these cities to date in Russia, and leading the pack are obviously Moscow and St. Petersburg. Moscow has an official population of 13 million people, and unofficially they say it's as many as 20 million people living in Moscow, and St. Petersburg has an official population of 5.5 million people, so very large cities. And every single one of these millionaire cities has its own region with dozens of satellite cities, which are slightly smaller but still every bit as developed and every bit as Western as you can possibly imagine. So if you're a tourist, for example, coming from Europe or North or South America, and if you're used to a Western lifestyle and Western culture, then any of these cities would be very comfortable for you. You would feel pretty much at home in them because, again, they are very well developed. They're extremely modern. and the culture there is highly westernized, so there wouldn't be any sort of a cultural shock for you. You would see a lot of new things, you would see a lot of new culture, but the way that it's presented is very accessible and it's very easy to understand for Western visitors. Which brings me to the next question about Russia from Google. Now, this country has a documented history of at least 1,300 years, and scattered throughout its very expansive territory are a seemingly endless array of really fantastic and unique monuments, museums, art galleries, historic estates, not to mention World Heritage sites. It's also hard to gloss over the beautiful cathedrals that you can find scattered throughout Russia, as well as the fortified cities, like the Kremlin in Moscow, for example. So we have several Kremlins across larger Russian cities, and some of them are actually even comparable in size to the one we have in Moscow. So they're all definitely worth the visit. But most of those things are related to history and culture, whereas there are a lot of tourists nowadays that are very interested in an active vacation when they're exploring new frontiers. So anybody that decides to explore Russia, they have a huge breadth of potential activities to partake in, both in the summertime and in the wintertime. So from skiing and mountain climbing in Sochi, or climbing Mount Elbrus, which is the highest mountain in Europe, to hitting the beach also in Sochi. So those are just some ideas of activities. And really, if you're somebody that loves nature and exploration, there's so much to be seen. If you go a little bit deeper into the Russian Far East, you can go whitewater rafting down Altai's rivers and rapids. You can swim in Lake Baikal, which is the deepest freshwater lake in the world, and it holds 20% of the Earth's unfrozen freshwater supply. And there are just so many other fantastic landmarks that are worth seeing. So if you go beyond these large cities, if you go beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg and Sochi, the place that most tourists tend to go to, there is really a lot to be seen. And with every year, there's an increase in the number of tourists that visit. So for the past couple of years, there have been about 24 million tourists visiting Russia every year, and there were slightly more last year because we had an influx due to the World Championships, to FIFA 18. So it definitely is a destination that's interesting to a lot of foreigners. And from personal experience, I can say that as I travel across Russia, as I travel to cities outside of the Moscow region, with every passing year, I see more and more visitors from abroad. And it's actually kind of surprising because sometimes you find yourself in cities that are definitely not really on the map. They're cities that people haven't heard of in Europe or in the United States, for example. And somehow these tourists find their way there and they really enjoy themselves. They have a great time because, Russian people are very hospitable. They're actually very approachable. They're very outgoing once you get to know them. But they're definitely very hospitable towards foreigners. So don't let some of the things you read online fool you. I've read quite a few articles by Western journalists that have never set foot in Russia that were meant to discourage readers from coming to Russia. So that makes no sense. If you have no personal experience, how could you possibly say whether or not a country is worth visiting? You should always be open to new experiences and to seeing new places and getting accustomed to new culture, and seeing things from a different perspective. And until you have that experience, it's very difficult to objectively say anything about it. So again, I do think, answering the question in a more brief format, I do think that Russia is a good place to visit. If nothing else, you'll definitely enjoy the fantastic Russian food, and you're bound to make a lot of friends during your stay here, and some of them might even end up visiting you once you head back home as well. Now, the next questions I've grouped together from Reddit and from Google because they're basically asking the same thing. Is Russia safe? Is it safe for a tourist to go to Russia? Is Moscow safe at night? Can Americans travel to Russia right now? And the answer to all of these questions is yes, and Russia is definitely safe. So like I said before, there are about 24 million tourists visiting Russia on a yearly basis. On average, there are only about 20 crimes involving tourists reported every year in Moscow, which makes Moscow one of the safest, large, bustling capital cities in the world. So if you compare it against New York, Paris, London, Moscow is one of the safest places to visit as a tourist. Now, obviously, just because Moscow has a statistically low crime rate, that doesn't exactly mean that you can't get yourself in trouble if you go out actively looking for trouble. So, for example, if you go out into the metro which is beautiful in Moscow, by the way. If you go into the metro with cash hanging out of your back pocket during peak hours, not paying attention to your surroundings, with your earbuds in your pockets, you fall asleep or something, you have a very good chance of getting pickpocketed. There's also a very good chance that anybody approaching you will be deterred by onlookers, but still, pickpocketing happens, and it happens all over the world in any large city with an abundance of tourists, especially with tourists that aren't really concerned about keeping an eye on their surroundings and having all of their personal items properly secured and stored and things like that. So Moscow is no exception to the rule that as a tourist, you need to be careful, you need to pay attention to the stuff going on around you. Again, that being said, crime is very insignificant, and even pickpocketing cases, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, have gotten exceedingly rare. As far as the question regarding whether or not Moscow is safe at night, I find that to be kind of a funny question because Moscow is a 24-hour city. It really never stops. It never sleeps. It's very similar to downtown New York. It's very similar to, again, other capital cities in the world. So there's no curfew. There's no set time after which you shouldn't leave your hotel. There are just dozens, if not hundreds, of restaurants, of bars, of pubs, of clubs that are open all night. And if you're not looking for a party, there are some museums and art galleries that are open around the clock. And on some special days throughout the year, all of the museums in Moscow are open 24 hours a day. So really, there's something to be found for anyone, regardless of what time it is. So obviously, you're free to roam around the city any time of day, wherever you'd like to go. And this is especially true during the summer because there's a lot more to do. There are a lot of recreational activities that just aren't available in the wintertime in Moscow, for example. So if you take Gorky Park, which is a fantastic family-oriented park, in the summertime, you'll have outdoor movie screenings, you'll have outdoor dance floors that are first come, first served, with DJs playing music, and there's just a lot of festivity and a lot of fun in the air. There's street food, there are people with families that are out all night, hanging out with their kids, riding bikes, skateboards, and if you go down Moscow River, you can take a cruise on the Radisson Cruise Lines or something like that. So there's a lot to do at night, and that's only more true during the summertime. During the wintertime, you're a little bit more limited in the number of activities that you can do, but it's still very festive. It's still very beautiful. If you take a look at my video of wintertime Moscow, that'll just give you an idea of some of the decorations you have all across Moscow. And besides that, there are a lot of active things to do as well. So you can go skiing, you can go snowboarding, ice skating, and just exploring the city in the wintertime is very interesting in and of itself because you get totally different vibes. It's a completely different atmosphere than in the summertime. The city definitely changes during the winter in a lot of good ways as well. The next two questions that are worth covering that I've grouped together again are, is it expensive to travel Russia, and what kind of currency should you take with you when visiting Russia? So I'll start with the currency. If you do decide to come to Russia, the best currency to take with you, if you're adamant about taking cash with you, is dollars or euros, because you'll tend to get the best exchange rates for those currencies in Russian banks. And definitely don't exchange your money in airports, neither at home nor here in Moscow, because the exchange rates there are abominable. So you either need to exchange your money at home if you have a good bank with good exchange rates for rubles, or you can exchange your money upon arrival here in Russia at a bank that's closest to your hotel. As far as Russia being expensive to travel, some people misunderstand the idea of exchange rates, and they assume that just because, for example, with the dollar, the exchange rate is currently something like 67 rubles to the dollar, just because there's such a large exchange rate that your purchasing power will be dozens of times more powerful here in Russia than in the US, and that's just not the case. That's not how exchanges work at all. Now, that being said, generally speaking, prices in Russia will be lower across the board than in Europe or in the US. So you'll be paying less at restaurants, you'll be paying less for all sorts of consumer goods, for food, for, I don't know, going to the movies, going to museums. You'll be paying less for your cell phone plan. So prices, again, in general, are much, much lower for a lot of things. Now, that being said, if you visit a really upscale restaurant in the very center of Moscow, like a posh place, then you might end up paying even a lot more than you would have paid in New York or in Paris. So there are some places that are incredibly, incredibly expensive. But if you're talking about taking a vacation across Russia, if you're talking about traveling between cities, It will generally be cheaper to go on a long distance trip through Russia, through several cities in Russia, than to go on a similar trip in Europe or the US. Now, for a lot of reasons, if you're taking the train rates will be a lot cheaper than in the aforementioned regions. If you rent a car rentals will probably be cheaper. Gas is obviously gas and diesel are cheaper than in Europe and the US. And again, a lot of the activities that you're going to be taking part in will come across as a very good deal. All right, so moving on to the next question, and this one comes from Reddit. What is it like for foreigners living in Russia today? This is a very extensive question, and it's hard to cover it in just this one video, especially as a part of a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I'll get to you as soon as I can. But the main point that I'd like to cover in a condensed version is that there are a lot of expats living in Russia. There are just sprawling expat communities all throughout the millionaire cities that I talked about before. And if you go out looking, you'll be sure to find somebody that's from your native country. In any of these cities. Most of the expats living in Russia, living long term, are usually highly qualified specialists. If you're referring to people from Western countries, so they'll be specialists like lawyers, doctors, programmers, top managers that are representing their companies here in Moscow, and the list really goes on. These specialists, they tend to integrate pretty well into Russian society. If we're talking about the individuals that have spent years living here, so 5-10 years, for example, they definitely know Russian, they know their way around Russia, and they travel quite a bit, they travel extensively. And yet the expat communities themselves stay really tightly interwoven regardless of how long these particular individuals have lived in Russia. So for example, you have certain communities like apartment buildings and townhouses where it's pretty much well known that expats from a certain country tend to live there, or you might have things like pubs, bars, and restaurants that expats tend to visit. So in Moscow, there are several bars that you can visit, and if you go in there, you're bound to hear a lot of English and very little, if any, Russian at all. These communities are very large, they're very active, and I would say that in general, expats tend to enjoy their time here in Russia. They like the living conditions, they like the lifestyle that they lead here, and I personally know quite a few expats professionally and as close friends that have lived here for several years. There are actually a lot of perks to being a foreigner in one of the larger cities in Russia. So there are certain job opportunities that are really only open to you if you're a native English speaker. Salaries in general tend to be a lot higher for foreigners for most of the jobs across the board. If you're talking about qualified work, again, you're looking at salaries that are 1.5 to 2 times higher than the average for whatever region you happen to be considering. And in general, salaries in Russia, this is something that's definitely worth mentioning as well. Salaries in Russia are definitely lower than what you would have in Europe or in the US, but again, cost of life is also significantly lower. So if you're not completely intent on buying an apartment in the very center of Moscow overlooking the Kremlin, where the prices are just insane, if you're willing to move a few kilometers into the suburbs, you can find very nice brand new apartments in the Moscow region, like 1-bedroom apartments for 1.5 to 2 million rubles, which is like somewhere around $25,000-$30,000, and that's right next to Moscow. You can probably find similarly priced apartments in Moscow as well, but they might not be brand new. So housing in general is very approachable, and I've already mentioned that consumer goods are on average relatively inexpensive. The only thing that's really going to be more expensive in Russia than in Europe or in the US are goods that are imported. So things like automobiles, they tend to be more expensive in Russia if they're not built at a localized plant, just because of the additional taxes that are applied to it when the goods pass through customs. You should also keep in mind that various services that you pay for on a regular basis are generally cheaper in Russia. So things like medicine. In Russia, if you pay at face value for whatever medical services you get, like dental, for example, you pay at face value for the materials and the work that the dentist has done. You might actually end up paying less than you would be paying for insurance in Europe or in the US. So the costs here are much lower by several orders of magnitude, as a matter of fact. The same thing can be said about maintenance costs for your home or your apartment. Maintenance costs are just astronomically lower as compared to, again, what you would be paying in the US. If you earn a relatively high salary and you live in one of the larger Russian cities, you won't have any issues saving up enough money to buy your own place. You'll be able to support a lavish lifestyle if that's of interest to you. And if you're more budget minded, then you'll have even more purchasing power in the long run. But I can definitely say that you won't be any less comfortable than if you were to reside in your country of origin, be it in Europe, Asia, or in any of the Americas. I recently saw a post on Reddit where the individual was discouraging others from going to Russia for work specifically, because as they said, in Russia you would definitely earn a lot less than you would if you just stayed in your home country, which isn't necessarily true. That might be true depending on your profession and depending on your qualifications. But again, keep in mind the difference in prices, the difference in the cost of life in Russia. So that's very important. You might be earning less here in Russia, but you might be able to afford a much nicer lifestyle. That's one. And two, if you are a very highly qualified specialist, you might actually earn quite a bit more in one of the larger Russian cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, because some of the job opportunities in these cities, again, are very, very lucrative, and they're only open to expats. And the only way to get these individuals to essentially uproot their lives and move to a completely different country is to offer them very lucrative compensation packages, which oftentimes include extremely high salaries. Sometimes these will be even higher than in their country of origin, to offer them various perks, and there are so many variants of the perks that you might get. Things like included flights back to your home country several times a year. You might get compensation for your apartment. You might get compensation for dining. You might get free tours and vacations in Moscow, all expenses covered types of things. Overall, I'd say coming to Russia is a very interesting and positive experience for most foreigners, whether it be long term for work or just for a vacation or a road trip. So don't let the difficulties of getting a visa, for example, scare you out of coming here. Don't let some of the things that people write online, completely uninformed, once again, scare you away from coming to Russia. No country is perfect. Russia definitely has its fair share of issues, but I can't cover everything in one video. And if there's a single central point that I wanted to get across, it's the fact that Russia in general is a lot more similar to European countries or to Northern American countries than you might think, and you would feel very at home here, and you would feel very comfortable living here or vacationing here for that matter as well. All right, so we have a few very specific questions left, so I'm just going to blast through them if you don't mind. Do Russian trains encounter delays in the wintertime? All right, so Russian railways are a very effective way to get around the country. They're very cheap and they're very comfortable. It's very easy to get from point A to point B and to explore a lot of cities very quickly using the railway system. It's just very efficient in my opinion. I've been to Sochi several times. I've been to Kislovodsk, and those are like 24 and 20-hour train rides. And I've gone to St. Petersburg several times by train. Not once have I experienced a delay at all, not even 10 minutes. So the train was in the train station exactly on time. That being said, if you're talking about the longest train routes, like from Moscow to Vladivostok, which is like a 9,000-kilometer train ride, that takes about 144 hours. So you shouldn't be too surprised if you might lose 10-15 minutes at one of the stops along the way. So yeah, at the end of the trip, you might be a little bit delayed. But no, in general, it doesn't matter if it's wintertime or summertime, trains are very punctual in Russia. Can I drive my car in Russia with my normal driver's license? Yes and no. If you're from any country that signed the Geneva Convention, then yes, you can drive in Russia, but you need an international driver's permit, and those are very easy to get. You can get them before your trip. They usually cost a couple of bucks, and all it is basically a translation of your driver's license, your local driver's license, into several languages. And with these international driving permits, you can drive in a lot of countries all over the world, not just in Russia. So you need your IDP and proof of insurance, and then you're good to go. You can drive wherever your heart desires, and you're going to have a great time. I speak from personal experience. I've taken so many road trips across Russia, days-long road trips, and it's just a fantastic experience every time because the scenery is just beautiful everywhere you go. And by and large, all the roads are in very good conditions as well, and the average driving speed is very high. So you can get pretty far in a relatively short amount of time. All right, so we have just two questions remaining. What is a dacha? So dacha is a Russian word for country house. A lot of people, if not most Russians, have country homes. The reason for this is because during Soviet times, it was quite common to get free land plots or even sometimes free country homes based upon your social status, based upon what kind of job you had. So people, for example, with a lot of kids would be expedited to get a free land plot. So they would have an apartment in the city, although it was a small apartment, but still it was their own small apartment. And they would also have a small plot of land somewhere in the countryside. And typically Russians go between their apartments and their dacha once a week. So for the weekend, when they're done working, they'll go to their dacha and kind of relax there. And a lot of Russians also grow their own fruits and vegetables and things like that on their dachas. So it's a very multifunctional kind of thing. There's a whole dacha culture in Russia, and again, it's a topic for a whole video, really. And the last question is, can I use my mobile phone in Russia? Yes, you can use your mobile phone in Russia, although I don't recommend using your operator here because you're going to pay a lot for a lot of roaming charges. As soon as you fly into Russia, buy a local SIM card from MTS, Megaphone, or Beeline. You're going to have very, very cheap data, very cheap calls. You spend like $30 and you'll get 30 gigabytes or 40 gigabytes of 4G traffic and pretty much unlimited calls, unlimited SMS and things like that. So there's no reason to pay incredible sums of money to be connected through your home carrier. Local SIM cards are definitely the way to go, and that way you'll always be in contact with your friends and family regardless of where you are in Russia. Coverage is generally very good and there's 4G all over the place. Okay, so we've gotten through all of the questions. I'm sorry if my answers were a little bit too specific or too vague at times. It's kind of hard to stay on track when you're talking about such a broad topic as life in Russia. Plus, my kids interrupted me like a million times throughout this video, so I had to cut it quite a bit. In any case, I'd like to thank you guys very much for your attention. If you have any comments or questions about life in Russia, anything that you'd like me to answer, leave it below. I'd be more than happy to answer you and to film another Q&A video if there's enough material to warrant that. And until next time, I hope you have a great day, and I'll be seeing you soon on another normal day in Russia.